42% of their front store sales. But these are just regular non-prescription medicine, right? Wrong. CVS would often do research within their own stores, looking to see how many people would go to the over-the-counter aisle and how often people would leave without buying anything at all. After doing research and seeing that 17% of people that walked into those aisles walked away completely empty-handed, they decided to do something about it. So they decided to sell full-strength medicine instead, which helped increase their sales. The asset turnover ratio is used to determine the amount of sales that are generated from each dollar of asset. A higher asset turnover ratio does not necessarily mean a good thing. A lot of companies that have high profit generally tend to have a lower asset turnover. Both assets and sales revenue increased in 2009. Aside of the increase in sales due to the construction of new stores, Walgreens decided to take a new approach towards customer satisfaction with the idea of customer-centric retailing, as mentioned by Bryce, enabling them to envision the company through their customers' eyes. Within a span of a year, from 2008 to 2009, Walgreens had remodeled and improved the layout of their stores, and at the same time educate their sales rep to improve customer satisfaction, overall increasing their sales by $4 billion and also increasing their assets by $2.73 billion. As I mentioned earlier, a higher asset turnover does not necessarily mean that the company is doing better. CVS has a lower asset turnover. Does that mean that they have a high amount of sales? Yes. In 2009, CVS had a total of $98.73 billion in sales, and with $61.64 billion in assets. CVS is a pretty smart company. Rather than to actually go ahead and construct new stores, they decided to construct other subsidiary businesses, such as mini clinics to help boost up their sales. These mini clinics would actually have real nurses trained to diagnose customers with common illnesses. CVS also decided to purchase 521 Long's drugstores in the year 2008, which also dramatically boosted up their sales by $11 billion within a year. That's a lot of money.
So the payout ratio is the amount of earnings given back to shareholders in dividends. The lower the payout ratio, it usually means the company is investing more into the business for future growth. So if we look on the chart here, Walgreens, this is a year-by-year comparison. In 2009, Walgreens had 22% and 2008, 18.24%. As you can see, the payout percentage increased, which is bad. It means they're giving their shareholders less dividends. In this market environment, companies are slashing their dividends in effort to conserve cash. Walgreens is unfortunately caught in this scenario. By giving shareholders less, it allows Walgreens to open more store locations and make plans for storefront restructure and improvements. So this is a company-to-company comparison. Walgreens again in 2009 with 22% and CVS with 12%. CVS has managed to lower their dividend ratio, lowering their payout ratio by 10%. But if you compare CVS's year-to-year ratios, in 2008 they had 11.98%, which means they have increased their payout ratio by 0.02%. This supports the statement that all companies are slashing their dividends to conserve cash in this saturated market.
So this ratio is especially of importance to Walgreens for the year 2009, the year that we're analyzing, because it had 602 new store openings. The comparable sales growth ratio will help us to determine what amount of new sales are actually from Walgreens sales growth or if the result was from the new store openings. As you see from the ratio values here, Walgreens has an actual store productivity but from year 2008 to 2009, comparable sales growth decreases from 2% to 4%. With this kind of ratio, the more the number increases, the better. Thus, the $4,301 increase in net sales for year 2009 might indicate that it generated from the new store openings rather than the actual store productivity. Walgreens' comparable sales growth suffered more than CVS, for CVS's comparable sales growth decreased from 4.5% in 2008 to 3.3% in 2009. This may be due to Walgreens' many new store openings affecting the sales of pre-existing locations. The effect of cannibalizing, as Harry mentioned earlier, made Walgreens lose its existing store's customers to its new store, thus not currently increasing the total sales as Walgreens has hoped. From one of the articles we found, an analysis said that Walgreens' new stores are producing low incremental returns. So the president of Walgreens, Gregory Watson, suggests a slower expansion rate in response to this. It is believed that by slowing store openings, Walgreens could save around $500 million, therefore allowing Walgreens the flexibility to improve on their existing stores by investing in opening more clinics and expanding their prescription files, which could drive up their comparable sales growth.
Okay, so the generic dispensing rate is calculated by taking the total number of prescriptions, then divided by the number of prescriptions that were dispensed in one given time period. It is the metric number of all drugs that are dispensed. Doesn't matter if it has a generic or not, if it's generic or not. Prescriptions are not as vulnerable to be affected by this economic downturn because everyone still needs their prescriptions. Recently, patients seem to lean toward buying the generic drugs. They prefer the generic drugs rather than the name brand ones because it's cheaper. According to WikiInvest, Walgreens seems to benefit from people buying their generic drugs instead of the name brand ones. They get more reimbursements from certain groups like Medicare for selling the generic drugs. CVS, on the other hand, said they won't be affected that much by consumers that are trying to save money by buying generic prescription drugs. Like was mentioned before, they are making a lot of money off their non-prescription drugs. They are doing this by simplifying their signs. For example, they changed the sign that said analgesics to pain relief. This makes it easier for consumers to understand what they're looking at and what they need. Patients go to retail pharmacy or they do a mail order to get their prescriptions filled. Walgreens is more like a retail pharmacy in which they sell a lot of generic drugs, unlike CVS, which would be more like a retail pharmacy and mail order pharmacy. Recently, people seem to favor the mail order over going to a retail pharmacy to get their prescriptions filled. This would explain why the generic dispensing rate has dropped for Walgreens 73.9% to 67.1%. And it also explained why CVS generic dispensing rate went up from 65.1% to 70.6%. People are now using more mail order pharmacies rather than wasting their time going to retail stores.
The sales per square foot ratio is a very useful ratio to indicate the productive of a retail business. For retail industry, the rental cost of space operating is one of the largest costs. So it also indicates how successful the company is making of money off this key axis. Companies with lower sales per square foot ratios have fewer cushion to cover their expenses, and their business model might not make the best use possible of their retail space. By comparing the sales per square foot ratio of Walgreens and CVS in 2008, Walgreens has $776 versus CVS's $1,345. And also CVS has less square footage than Walgreens, which indicates that CVS is more productive in terms of using its resource and controlling its expense. Unlike CVS, Walgreens tend to grow up organically rather than through acquisitions. And therefore, expanding the store chain will increase the cost for Walgreens. However, for its competitor CVS, since it expands the business through acquisition, Instead of spend its resource building the stores from the ground up, CVS spend its resource and focus on how to provide better service to the customer. For example, provide more personal service in the also at a certain time of the day when the store tend to have more customers who are on the chronic medications. In contrast, Walgreens had a big layoff in this year and remodeling the front-end section of their stores by eliminating the numbers of inventories and focus on the popular merchandise in order to cut down the expense. And that is why CVS remains higher sales per square foot than Walgreens.